Ready?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Stephen Goldsmith, Director, Data Smart City Program at Harvard Kennedy School.
Thank you. Let me introduce the rest of the panel, and you can applaud for them as a group. First, Lourdes German, the Director of International Institute-Wide Initiatives at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Thank you. Hadassah Damien, the Manager of Engagement Technology at the Participatory Budgeting Project. Beth Noveck, Founder and Director of GovLab, right here nearby. And Dr. Amin-Ra Mashariki, the CAO, Chief Analytics Officer of the NYC and Head of Open Data. Now, please welcome our panel. All right. I have this really great first question, but I'm momentarily distracted by Amin's shoes. Because you can't, if you're in the back row, you're missing something pretty substantial here. So we have about 35 minutes. We got a panel of really very expert individuals. But I want to think about open data in a little bit more kind of provocative way, right? So, you know, as everybody celebrates open data, every city has open data, but so what? I mean, it really, that ought to be just like the table stakes to get into the game. So let me start on that end and come this way, and first say, so Amin, there's a lot of open data. You know, when I was deputy mayor of New York City, city passed an ordinance that everything should be open. So people put up ugly PDFs, checked the box, and moved on to the next more important project, right? So you're now running a maybe the country's most sophisticated data analytics effort. How do you prioritize it, and what is the so what? Leave out transparency for a second. So what about open data? How are you using it to make life better in New York City?
That's a great question, Steve. So when I started, we published, Steve is right, New York City has one of the most ambitious and robust open data laws. And when I started, I felt like that wasn't enough. So we published a strategy that you can see online called Open Data for All. And so the idea, the core concept behind Open Data for All is that is data truly open? Can we truly call it open if only a small segment of New Yorkers actually know that the portal exists and actually know what to do with the data? So we implemented, we wrote this strategy, and then we began to implement certain tactics to close the gap between New Yorkers and ultimately them using open data in order to change their frameworks and how they engage with the city. So it is no longer do you have to be a statistician, and no longer do you have to be a great computer scientist or a mathematician to use the data to have some sort of impact in your community or impact on yourself. So with that strategy, we did a number of things. What I will do is just digress and quickly take 2 seconds to talk about a great thing that happened in New York City around open data last year. So we know someone, there's a resident of New York named Ben Wellington. And so Ben Wellington runs this blog called iQuantNY. And Ben essentially went on and he found that for open data, we publish tickets. If you've been ticketed in New York City, we don't publish your personal information, but we publish where you got the ticket and how much you paid for the ticket. He used that data and he used Google Maps to find where people were ticketed near pedestrian ramps. Now what's interesting about that is in 2008, City Council passed a law that said it is legal, where it was formerly illegal, but it is now legal to park in front of a pedestrian ramp. So he found that since 2008 to now, to 2016, he did it the end of last year, to 2016, that New Yorkers had been ticketed incorrectly to the tune of millions of dollars, right? And so, but he used all of the data was on the open data portal. And so what he did was he reached out to my office and said, hey, I'm going to publish this blog. It's going to get picked up by all of these national and even some international press. It's going to make NYPD look not so hot. I'm just giving you a heads up. They haven't responded to me. I'm letting you know. So my office engaged with City Hall to engage with NYPD because we saw this as a big open data win. This may not have been the most awesome thing for NYPD, but it was a big open data win. And interestingly enough, NYPD saw it that way. They did the analysis themselves and they said, hey, you know what, you're right, but here's the thing. Open data allowed for Ben to go in, and so what NYPD said is we're gonna retrain all of our officers and then we're gonna put in the effort to reimburse those funds. Around that time, my dad was having some medical complications, and I went to it's a true story, I went to Brooklyn Hospital to see him. He has like the oxygen thing in his nose and so on and so forth. And I walk in and he says, you know, so glad to see you. I'm like, yeah, me too, man. What do you need me to do for you? I used to work at Hopkins, I can call some doctors. He said, do I have to talk to you to get my reimbursement on those tickets that I got? Or who do I talk to, right? And so that was a powerful way where we allowed, we released open data that allowed for Ben Wellington to do this analysis that allowed for him to engage the city, and then the city to respond in kind and say, thank you for helping us. We're now a better and even a smarter city because of that.
So, so that's one. So one use of open data, right, is so people get out of their parking tickets, right? We got that figured out. And New York City has begun to well visualize data, so that makes it usable. But let me move to Beth and kind of challenge the conversation a little bit. So, but you have whether the bus will arrive on time and other data analytics. But let's think about the really important issues of social justice, right? So are these applications of open data distracting to the larger issues of social justice? And you're both an academic and run a lab that advises public officials. How do you think about those two issues?
Well, I think about the fact that, look, every technology can be used for good or for ill. And obviously one of the goals that we have, I think, with open data is to use it as a force for moral good. And I think the story that Amin tells is twofold. One is that the larger good that we're pursuing, it's not simply reduction of parking tickets, which we consider as maybe morally neutral, but although I'm very much in favor of reducing tickets, but it's promoting citizen engagement. It's promoting civic participation. It's promoting a stronger democratic fabric. That said, there are people who are very worried, and it is not uncontroversial, and we have to acknowledge the fact that time spent and money invested in infrastructure and in projects that are designed, for example, to improve the commuting experience by telling people when their bus is coming or when their subway is coming, something we all appreciate here in New York City, maybe time that's taken away from things like scrutinizing government spending and looking at budgets, or trying to look at other issues around, for example, use of data to improve educational outcomes or reduce mass incarceration. I think the point of open data, though, as distinct from how we've thought about transparency before, is that because it enables third parties to engage with data, we can have a much broader audience of people working on a wider range of issues than when we just, say, release a FOIA request to a single person. When we put up preemptively a whole class of data, you can find the Ben Wellingtons of the world who want to look at this specific issue using that data set, which does not preclude someone else from looking at another issue, and it also augments the fact that Amin's office, if it were left only to your office to do, it never would have happened in the first place, because you can never have enough people. So I think the point is we have to be conscious of the fact that open data can be used for a wide variety of purposes that range from the commercial to the, let's call it, more transparency or government accountability arguments. But when we open up the data, what we do is enable many more people to solve the problems that they care about. Is it the same problems that I care about? No, it may not be, but the point is that we have that long tail of opportunity to engage in new ways. Now, one last caveat, which is to say there's not an infinite number of people, there isn't an infinite amount of time and infrastructure to solve every problem, so I do think we need to be asking ourselves, is this a project that advances the greater good? Are we doing something that advances social justice in our communities? Absolutely, we should have a sense of values and of mission to what we do. But I think those values can be broader than only advancing, let's say, government accountability, and might include solving the parking ticket problem and at the same time increasing civic participation and engagement.
That was great. So Hadassah, Beth has kind of perfectly introduced you here. So, we have massive amounts of distrust for government. We have citizens not engaged as much as they should be. Even though they're more engaged and have more confidence at the local level, it's still not a great number. And there's very few applications of kind of open governance that are more powerful than participatory budgeting. So could you do just a minute on the New York City Council participatory budgeting, and then explain why, if it's so cool, why don't we have more of it?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. Yeah, so I work for an organization called the Participatory Budgeting Project, and while we do work in 11 cities across North America, upholding 47 different participatory budgeting processes across North America right now, a bunch of those processes happen in New York City. So just last month, over 60% of New York City's districts, city council district members, gave $1 million within each of their districts, and we worked with them to coordinate a process by which individuals in those districts, constituents, came up with ideas and developed those into projects, worked with city agencies to find out if those projects were feasible, put those projects on ballots, and then a very few weeks ago, our preliminary numbers show that over 100,000 New Yorkers voted on these projects in their neighborhoods, right? So this is super interesting to me because when we think about open data, I think about both creating the data as well as what do we do with the data, right? And there's, as civic technologists, there's a big push, there's a fair amount of platforms or apps or tweet methodologies that allow us to collect citizen input, right? I think we can all think of a few. Let's get some citizen input. And citizen input is very, very important, but what I think is really neat about participatory budgeting is that it creates a full cycle, a feedback loop for that citizen input to go somewhere, right? So citizen input is itself a data set, right? What do people in their neighborhoods want? If you ask people what they want in their neighborhood, they have plenty of ideas, right? Each of us can be considered experts of our own experience, right? Of our specific geography, right? So when we take all of those ideas together, that itself is an open data set that then volunteers go ahead and process, right? They process that data, they turn it into projects. And in participatory budgeting, that's generally capital projects. In PBNYC, that is exactly what it is. So only things that are physical infrastructure that improve parks, schools, roads, buildings, etc. And so that data set then gets filtered down into these projects that get voted on. Now, that's one place where open data, the collecting of information is, we talk with smart cities about how do we speed up data processing, how do we increase the amount of information that flows quickly. But with participatory budgeting, something that works really well is slowing down the collection process so that as many people as possible can contribute to this data set, right? So it's not only collecting digitally, it's not only collecting through tweets, right? It's having what's called mobile assemblies, being on a street corner and saying, hey, how would you spend $1 million in your neighborhood? And concatenating all of those ideas gathered verbally, on paper, and digitally into a data set, right? So participatory budgeting really focuses on civic engagement, right? Gathering lots and lots of information from lots of people to come out with these ideas that then are a form of open data, right? We create a data set. Something else that we also do, though, and I think as civic technologists, we're often asking the question of, technology for who? But another question in terms of data that we've been thinking about a lot is data about who and data collected by who, right? As Steve said, the levels of trust in our government right now are at all-time lows, and I think that perpetuates out into levels of trust in data that is perceived to come through government sources. So when our data is actually generated by the individuals who then go ahead and use it, that trust is there and the authentication is there, which then when constituents connect that that data set, right, back to their elected officials, right, there is a much stronger bond of believing that the elected official can believe that what people have said they want are things they want. People can believe that there's actually a place for their claims, their social claims, to go and be heard.
If you move from participation with open data for budgeting or capital projects, then you think about land use planning, right? You work for one of the preeminent organizations that thinks about land use planning. So help us imagine. You have city open data, you have state open data, you have federal government open data, you have third-party open data. You're a resident in a community. You're trying to understand how your community is moving. Is it getting poorer? Is it getting wealthier? Is it getting its fair share of services? Are the bus routes right? So talk to us, or maybe the IoT networks telling us a little bit about what's going on. Describe to the audience from the land use planning standpoint how open data could help people understand what's happening to them in their community.
Sure. I echo everything I've heard on this panel. There's so many issues around this topic thematically and both kind of with the transparency lens. When we approach the number of data projects that we're involved in as a private operating foundation where we fund projects and have this kind of requirement that we're significantly involved in all the work that we do, we think about impact and we think about outcomes. And the outcomes for us are kind of mandated by our charter to improve the quality of life through the work that we're doing and enabling others to do. In areas that include urban poverty, fiscally sustainable cities, climate change adaptations, or all the big thorny issues that we really think are at the center of quality of life for a citizen. And I'll start with a story so that you understand kind of the way we kind of approach and encounter those issues. So, two of our most significant data projects are key partners, the United Nations. And we had, at one juncture of sort of the very early planning stages of these projects, we had somebody from their Nairobi headquarters join us in Cambridge. And he put up a slide and said, take a look at that room. And it was a man seated at the center of a room, nothing on the walls, with a desk and a very tiny briefcase about this thick, leather. And he said, what do you think is in his briefcase? And I said, I don't know. And he said, that's the entire land registry for the city that he runs in writing, where he is the head of what would be urban planning here in the United States. And then he asked me, what date do you think I took this photo? And I won't admit that my naivete in saying maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago. He's like, I took that photo 2 weeks ago when I was in his office talking about beginning the pilots that we're about to begin. And that was about maybe, I would say, mid last year. And that's actually, that land registry was going home in handwritten form with this gentleman every single night and then coming back to this office. Not a single computer in sight, not a laptop, not a smartphone, nothing. And it was mind-blowing to me that this is 2016. So when we encounter a project like that, we think, what kind of impact would you scale if you're able to digitize what he brings home every single day, and you're able to actually have not just him, but the leaders that he works with across different sectors of government, marry that with data about how well laid out is the city. What is your revenue base? What is the level of urban poverty? Where is citizen migration coming from? And part of the project that this conversation fit into is something we call the Atlas of Urban Expansion, where we actually worked with NYU and other partners to look at, including the UN, cities from space for a period of about 30 years. So it included 4,231 cities that were made up of kind of 200 metro regions across every single continent. And we looked at them and said, what is the actual border of a city looking like and changing over time when you think about where migration patterns are happening, how well laid out are cities, where are roads in relation to where even formal and informal economic activity is happening, and collected a host of indicators, including affordable housing, regulatory, all data tied to how land is being used, and then what is sort of the impact of that loop to the citizens who live in those communities. And I think for the first time, we were able to understand and hopefully enable the leaders of those cities to understand how even though their geographic boundaries of cities on a map are X, Y, or Z, how that is actually changing in reality. And the results have really been, just kind of alarming for us, including other individuals across cities. And part of what we do then is start layering with other pilot projects financial data, urban poverty data, to really hopefully create something that could be a resource for the public good.
Okay, well, let's make the conversation more difficult. It's been too uplifting so far, and begin with Amen. So I don't know if there's a lot of talent in New York City. I don't know if this falls right in your wheelhouse, but let's go to open data. Somewhere in this audience, right, we'll randomly guess there's half these folks who want to use your data to build something good for New York City, right? And when I was here, the Big Apps program was pretty exciting, but it was also picking apps that may have been niche apps with respect to changing life, right? So what is it that you could do, or what is it that creates the challenge about how hackathons, big app contests, what do we do to make that data actually produce more value?
You are right. That is an interesting question to ask. I think here's what I will say is what my office, the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, has attempted to do, and is certainly a really challenging space, and that is to go out into the communities, the underrepresented communities, and sort of begin to engage around what are your challenges, right? And so we did a capstone with Columbia SEPA, where they went to non-profit organizations and just went in and just started asking simple questions, saying, do you use open data? Likely not. If not, why not? If you do, what are some of your concerns and challenges with using the portal as it is? And so we did a full sort of user engagement there. We did a capstone with CUSP, and we rely on capstones very heavily because I have no money. So we partner with academia for free. We did another capstone where we identified a metric around this concept of data poverty. And data poverty, as we see it at MODA, is where there is a likelihood that your community is not going to engage with data for any number of reasons. And we begin to identify what those number of reasons are. For instance, if you don't see yourself in data, you're highly unlikely to go to the portal and use data that isn't representative of anything that you're used to engaging with or doing, right? So if you go onto the open data portal and you see all of this public land use tax data, and it has nothing, and you're not a homeowner, the likelihood of you sort of engaging with that data goes down, as we saw in this concept, right? Also education and all of these things. And so for us, it was about going to the places where open data was not, and engaging and asking the tough questions. And it was also about figuring out who actually are users of open data. I've sat down with countless, actually that's not true, I can count them, it's about 7, vendors, and asked them, when you create an open data portal, who are your users? And they all say, everyone. Well, I was a software engineer at the beginning of my technology career, and I know that you always build a product with the user in mind. So don't sell to me that, well, just buy my product because everyone in your city can use it. I know you had a user in mind, and that user was likely an advanced a technologist or a statistician or something like that. And so we began to understand that we needed to go out and engage the people who weren't using open data, the people who didn't see value in open data, and bring them to the fore. So that for us, it was about doing what we do at MODA on Analytics Project, which is identifying the problem first and identifying the people who have the problem, and then looking to see if data can be applied to that problem. So once we got out and engaged the users, then we can talk to them about using data to help take on their challenges. But before that, it's like taking data and just showering it on people and saying, well, knock yourselves out, awesomeness has just happened to you, and keep moving forward, right? But we went out into the communities, the underserved communities, and engaged and have it. This is a continual process, bringing them to the fore.
So, so we know that from the panelists and your comments in particular, I mean, right, the data's got to be well visualized, it's got to respond to a use case. There's a responsibility on the part of government to help educate folks, particularly those from underserved communities, about what are the benefits of open data. Beth, think about this slightly differently. What are the obstacles that keep government, Agency 1, from using the open data in Agency 2, right? If you want to create a resilient city, what are the obstacles of using data inside your city that might be open to build something valuable?
I'll be very brief here. 3 quick things. So I think first, with regard to the innovations and the projects that you mentioned at the beginning, sort of hackathons and apathons and all this sort of stuff, we see lots of innovation, lots of great ideas thrown up, but a great deal of difficulty with then landing them inside of institutions, knowing how to turn a good idea into something that an agency knows how to use and scale to a wider number of people. 2, we have lots of open data, and Amin has done yeoman's work to invest in getting communities to be able to use that data. There's also a lot of work that you and others do and need to do more of to enable institutions to make use of the data. So one of the things we're seeing, for example, is a tremendous deficit in personnel who are data science savvy inside the public sector. Public sector cannot compete with the private sector. Even the private sector has trouble getting all of the data savvy people they need. We have a generational lag where we need to catch up in terms of training and thinking about then who goes into the public sector and creating more jobs that have titles like yours, where you just have people across the public service and public sector who know how to work with data, and more importantly, how to ask a question and then associate data with answering that question. So we have institutional hurdles simply on a capacity and a talent side. And finally, I think a lot of what we're seeing is the challenge not around uses of purely open data, but responsible and ethical uses of, let me call it semi-open data that might contain some personally identifiable information, educational data, criminal justice data, administrative data that agencies often have and hold, need to share with others, for example, between criminal justice and mental health, if we're to deal with a problem like reducing the number of mentally ill who are incarcerated. And we don't yet have the capacity, either technically, legally, culturally, or in terms of governance norms and mechanisms for knowing how to share data effectively and make use of data. So we have a lot of catching up to do, I think, on the institutional side. Hopefully some of the work you're doing and others are doing to train people in the community. We've been running a data science camp for teenagers. Hopefully some of those kids who are developing the skills are going to turn around someday and become public servants and create institutions that are more data ready.
So in that vein, Hadassah, if you wanted to get citizens to participate, right, so what 2 or 3 things would you recommend? I mean, in terms of, you wouldn't measure open data success by data sets published. That seems like a pretty superficial way. So how do you think about thematic data or metadata or data organized around a particular topic? What would be the 2 or 3 things you'd recommend to the audience that would make open data most valuable for participation?
That is a great question. And as a database developer, I love to talk about metadata, but I want to talk about a really specific way that the participatory budgeting is giving a framework to users. And so I described how participatory budgeting works is that there's a whole bunch of people who throw out ideas about things they want to spend money on in their neighborhood. That's great, but what I didn't tell you is that there's a next step in the process where things like open data are used to actually analyze what is a good project in my neighborhood, what's going to serve my locality, right? So open data is used for democratic decision making, and kind of like Ahmed said, just throwing data at people, hey, go make some democratic decisions about your neighborhood, is not a helpful framework. So in the context of participatory budgeting, we've been using the framework of public health, specifically the county health rankings, to give people a specific framework in which they can go find specific metrics that they can then easily, much more easily research, right? and come up with information about their neighborhood. And those metrics are often specifically education, right? And so if you want to understand education, we'd like you to go look at graduation rate and percent of people who have college degrees, right, in your neighborhood, right? So we give people specific metrics, which then allows folks who are maybe not data scientists or maybe folks who aren't even necessarily super digitally savvy to have a specific thing to go find in open data, which is much more, it just allows a lot more participation and accessibility, right? When you're encouraging someone to look for something specific in information. So I would say to the people out there, providing a framework and actually giving a guideline is part of the responsibility that we have as people who are super data savvy to help people and give them specific use cases in which they can use this open data that has been so thoughtfully collected.
So let's, by the way, there was 45 minutes for this session, and every minute we're losing a minute and a half's time, so we're down to 5 minutes. I don't quite, there's some open data issue here, I think, on the clock. But we've got 4 minutes and 43 seconds left. So Lourdes, can we start with you and go this direction? And use 1 minute each to tell the audience the best application of open data to solve a problem you've seen that they should copy.
Before answering that question, I want to underscore something that both Beth and Ahmed said on the panel earlier. I think kind of the components of digital, what I think of as kind of digital literacy, have to be present, not just kind of within the people who create these applications, but even kind of when you think about the internal administrative user base sort of that's going to carry that out with political will, hopefully, but then also within your citizen user base. And when we were partnering with one university to talk about this, they said, we should probably offer classes on basic Excel to make sure that people who are just using basic like Microsoft desktop applications know how to attach something to an email as a first component, and that's here in the United States, not even where the land registry goes home in somebody's briefcase every night. The best application that I would say I've seen, that's a tough one. I think it's sort of the open data portals that aggregate information. So even though it's not out yet, I think the redesigned usaspending.gov has really been designed with kind of the citizen user in mind who wants to understand and peer into their government at a different level. And I think with the changes in the Data Act, I feel really good that that's going to change the way we think about at least the way we understand federal government data.
Good, thanks very much. Hadassah, the best application you can think of.
I mean, watching someone actually build and look at a map of their neighborhood and see the light bulb moment of, yeah, that is what my neighborhood looks like. And that personal connection to open data, I think, is a fantastic application and really worthwhile in encouraging people to be able to do.
Great answer. Beth?
Two quick favorites. Safecast, a platform for citizens to collect and then publish and share data, originally around radiation levels after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, now for nuclear and other sites all over the world. They just unveiled their SolarCast air quality monitoring app, again, data for citizens by citizens, and of course PulsePoint, activated 20,000 times using an open data feed of 911 emergency calls to co-locate people having a heart attack with people who have CPR expertise to save lives.
That was good too. See if you can top that.
No, I doubt it, but what I will do is plug my office and say that my favorite application is a project we worked on. We partnered with the Commissioner on Human Rights to identify likely cases of income discrimination within New York City. So it's illegal in New York City to discriminate on someone based on any number of things. Income is one of them, and so if you have Section 8 housing voucher, and if you go to rent an apartment, and you feel like you've been discriminated against and not allowed to rent that apartment because you have Section 8, that's illegal, and those get shared with the Commissioner on Human Rights. Commissioner on Human Rights came to us and said, we no longer want to be a reactionary office around this, which is we only know when people tell us. We would like you to work with us to identify where there are areas in New York City where that sort of discrimination is likely happening. And so my office partnered with them to do that, and we use all open data for that effort, and it's been a very successful, because they take those areas and then they send, which is the most fun part, actors and actresses to go and test if our model is correct, and it's been a very successful effort to date.
That was great. There are no audience questions in these sessions, but you can send in your digital questions wherever you're supposed to. That's in your packet there somewhere. The purpose of this, we had really 4 of the leading experts in the country on this subject. The purpose of this panel was to show that open data is no longer just about opening data. It's no longer just about transparency. It's about solving problems. It's about citizen participation. It's a much more substantial and much more complicated conversation than ever before. Please help me thank our panelists.
Ladies and gentlemen, next up on this stage, starting at 4:30, will be a panel. The next panel on this stage will be at 4:30 p.m. Thank you. It'll be on safety first. Ladies and gentlemen, anybody that would like to see the keynote currently going on in Dugal 1 should make their way there down the steps to see the keynote in Dugal 1. That is now. Thank you.
you.